Welcome to Urban Dharma, the podcast, where suffering is optional. Hi, this is Reverend Kusala coming to you from downtown Los Angeles, from the International Buddhist Meditation Center. It's Sunday afternoon. It's actually comfortable today. It's supposed to be in the high 70s, low 80s. So what a change of pace this is. Well, the podcast you're about to hear is an interview I did with my friend Reverend Nori Ito, who is a Buddhist priest at a Japanese Pureland Temple in downtown Los Angeles. And we had a wonderful interview. I just got through listening to it again, and we covered a lot of territory. We talked about how he moved to America in the early 50s, how he didn't know if he wanted to be a priest or not, even though his father and grandfather had been priests in Japanese temples. His school years, his ordination, his work with the Buddhist Catholic Dialogue, starting the Buddhist Club at Occidental College, and last but not least, taking students from his temple to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to introduce them to the horrors of nuclear war. So again, we covered a lot of information. This particular podcast is about an hour and 18 minutes long. So set some time aside and listen, if you'd like, to my interview with Reverend Nori Ito about being a Buddhist priest in Los Angeles. This is Wednesday. It's a little bit after 3 o'clock, and I'm in downtown Los Angeles on 3rd Street, and I'm in a Japanese Buddhist temple, and I'm going to ask Reverend Nori Ito to pronounce it for me.
Higashi Honganji Buddhist Temple.
Oh, thank you. Reverend Ito and I met years ago. We're both involved with Buddhist clubs. I'm at UCLA, and Reverend Ito's at Occidental College. We're also both part of the Buddhist Catholic Dialogue in Los Angeles. So we've come together many times, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind doing an interview, and he said, I wouldn't mind. So I'm here today, and I'd like to start. My first question would be, were you born a Buddhist, or did you come to Buddhism later in life?
Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify that.
Oh,
I didn't say I wouldn't mind. I said I'd be honored.
Oh, okay.
But, yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Yes. I was born a Buddhist. My father was a priest, and my grandfather, on both sides, they were both priests. So I come from a long line of Buddhist priests.
Okay. And for people listening, the word priest and monk are different. Priests in the Japanese tradition are allowed to be married and have children and a wife, and you're married and have 3 children?
Yes.
3 children, okay. Were you born in Japan, or were you born in America?
I was born in Japan.
Okay. And when did you come to America?
I came with my family. My father was assigned to the temple in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
He was assigned in 1953.
1953.
And the rest of the family, we stayed in Japan for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And he realized that he couldn't go back to Japan right away, and so he called for us. And we came in 1955. I was almost 7 at the time.
Okay. And was he happy about coming to America?
He really wasn't, to be honest, because, we, in our tradition, Jodo Shinshu tradition, we have we've had a married clergy ever since the beginning. Mm-hmm. So about 800 years of married clergy.
Okay.
And he was the second son of his temple, so therefore he wouldn't take over, the temple of his birth. But for second and third sons, oftentimes what happens is they marry into another temple that doesn't have a son, or maybe work at our headquarters, as a staff priest or something like that. And so he was working for a long time for our mother temple in Kyoto, and being transferred to different areas, serving at different temples. But he happened to meet my mother's brother. And my mother was a kind of a strange situation where she was born into a temple with a lot of brothers and sisters, but she had an aunt and uncle who had no children. And so she was promised to them because she was like the second daughter.
I see.
Fourth down, from among all of the children.
Okay.
And so she was promised to my aunt and uncle's temple, or her aunt and uncle's temple.
Okay.
And so she grew up there. But being that there was no son, eventually she was going to be asked to marry someone who would come in and take over the temple. And so her older brother happened to be a friend of my father. They were introduced, and he he became the head priest of that temple. And it was around that time that his father or father-in-law was still healthy, and so he was serving down in the Kyushu area, way down south, and then also served up in Hokkaido, way up, the northernmost island. And one of the administrators of the Mother Temple came to see him one day and said, "We have a problem. The priest at our temple in Los Angeles is getting set to return to Japan, and we need someone to replace him. And so, will you go?" And he actually said that he's not the right person because he can't speak a word of English. His English teacher at Old Town University was D.T. Suzuki's wife.
Wow.
Beatrice Suzuki.
Yeah.
And he said that he was the worst student. And so he wouldn't be of any use in Los Angeles. Plus, he had been adopted into his wife's temple, and that he had the responsibility to take over that temple after his father-in-law retired. And so he can't go to Los Angeles. Well, so then they took no for an answer the first time, but they came back a few months later and said, "We really need you to go. Can you just go for 1 or 2 years?" And so he accepted the appointment, came over by himself. And once he got here and got to meet the members of the temple and to see the situation for himself, he realized that he couldn't return right away. And that's when he called us 2 years later to join him.
So he sensed a great need for his services here.
Right.
And he may have liked Los Angeles once he got here, anyway.
I think so.
With the weather. And,
yes. And then I think that the other thing was, this was back in the 50s.
Yes. When
the Japanese communities were still, kind of intact and, very vibrant. And the first generation were still, in control of the community and of the temples. And so you really didn't need to speak good English to get by.
So he was probably living in a Japanese neighborhood.
Right.
Businesses he frequented spoke Japanese.
Right.
And, Okay.
So he pretty much served his whole career without really speaking English. I mean,
without having
get by.
to speak English, huh? Yeah. So when you came over, then you, I imagine, learned English. It would probably be a lot easier because you were young.
Yeah.
And you were in pretty much the Japanese culture, I would imagine, within the L.A. culture.
Right.
Okay.
It was a kind of getting used to, being in an English-speaking community, or in an English-speaking country, but where Japanese was, spoken, at least at the temple and, at home, and so forth. And so I started first grade, in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And went through high school in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles.
Oh. Okay, so you were reading and writing English right from the get-go, as they say. Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think my father realized that after maybe 4 or 5 years and, the children getting used to life here and learning English quickly and kind of starting to put aside, our native language, and the culture and so forth, that he realized that if we were in Japan, then I would automatically have been chosen to take over after my father at the family temple. But in the United States, the temples aren't run, in the traditional way. And so when a minister or priest retires or passes away, then a new one is, found and put into place. And so it's not a automatic succession from father to son.
I see.
And he realized that I was just, quickly becoming American and just kind of, didn't express any real interest in the temple, other than having to be there all the time. I think he made the conscious choice not to force it, and not even to mention it. And I came over at such a young age that I didn't know the Japanese system.
Yeah.
And so I just figured, well, he's giving me the freedom to, be who I am, to be who I wanted to be, and to pursue whatever, ambitions, dreams I had. So he never mentioned, as I was growing up, that he would like me to consider, the priesthood.
I see.
Coming into the temple. And so Japanese also, the language, my parents sent me to, we had Japanese language schools back in those days.
Ah.
And it was, right in our neighborhood.
So you would go to school, learn English.
Yes.
And then you go to Japanese school to learn Japanese.
Yeah. Nowadays, it's only on Saturdays.
I see.
But back in the 50s, it was every day.
Wow.
And so we'd go to public school till 3 o'clock, and then maybe at 4 o'clock for another couple of hours, hour and a half or so, we'd be in Japanese school. And I hated it. I couldn't stand it. And all I could think of was, how am I going to get out of this?
Yeah.
Because many of my friends didn't have that, didn't have that obligation. And
sure.
So I only took 2 years of Japanese school, and I was able to find a way out. And by the time I was in high school, my parents really still hadn't learned how to speak English, fluently. And so I would talk to them in English, they would respond in Japanese, and that's how we were able to maintain a conversation.
Wow. Now, growing up in L.A. in the 50s as a Buddhist, did you feel any sense of prejudice or confusion? Because I would imagine that most of the kids at school were probably Christian, or some Jews, and maybe some Muslims as well.
Right.
So how did a Buddhist kid growing up in L.A. feel about being a Buddhist?
It was, we lived in an area where there were other Japanese Americans and Japanese American Buddhists.
Okay.
And so many of my friends, either through like Dharma school or through youth activities or through sports, came in and out of the temple. The families were members and so forth.
Did the temples have sports programs?
Yes,
and youth programs?
We had scouting programs.
Okay.
We had sports. We functioned not only as a temple but almost kind of as a community center.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of cultural, activities, tea ceremony, flower arrangement being taught and so forth. And so it was comfortable as long as you were in the community.
In the Japanese community?
Yeah. Or even in the neighborhood.
Okay.
Because we were all accepted. The Japanese Americans were accepted by the other ethnic.
And were most of the Japanese Americans Buddhist in your neighborhood?
It was probably, I don't really know, but I think it was probably about half and half.
Half and half.
Because we actually had 2 Japanese American Christian churches too. There was a Free Methodist church and there was a Baptist church.
Okay.
Right in the same neighborhood.
Okay.
With 2 Buddhist temples and a couple of like Shinto-based, religious organizations. The Konko Church and Tendikyo. And but I would have to say though that admitting that I was a Buddhist, like outside of my community, was something that I really didn't do. And I don't know I don't remember if it was a conscious thing, but it was something that you just kind of kept to yourself.
Okay.
You didn't wear it on your lapel.
Yeah.
And I see, like, my own children, 40 years later.
Yeah.
And things have changed. I think Buddhism has become much, better understood, much more accepted, in today's society, especially in Southern California, that they're very proud to be Buddhist, and they can, announce to anybody, I am a Buddhist. And that's a very distinct difference between how I grew up.
Okay. Now, when you went to college, was there Buddhist clubs in college?
No.
There weren't any Buddhist clubs?
Occidental, back in those days, was still pretty strongly Christian.
Okay.
It started out as a Presbyterian college.
Oh, it did?
But by the time I entered, the formal ties with the church were cut.
Okay.
But they still had, a very nice chapel, and they still had this requirement that every student had to take at least one semester, I think it was, of Bible studies or religion or philosophy course.
Hmm.
And so there were no Buddhist groups on campus. And if there was, probably that would have been the last group I would have joined anyway. But I don't remember ever even stepping into the chapel during the 4 years I was at Occidental.
Okay. And what was the point in your life when you decided that it might be a good career decision to be a Buddhist priest? Because it sounds like your father didn't want to pressure you.
Right.
And the cultural pressure that you would have found in Japan wasn't here in Los Angeles. So what was the turning point for you? When did you decide it was the right thing for you to do?
Well, if I can start a little bit earlier,
Please.
like I get out of high school, I graduate from high school and accepted to Occidental, and I feel as though that's kind of like my ticket out of the community, out of the Japanese American community, out of the temple.
And that would be going to college?
Going to college,
okay.
and kind of like, getting into so-called mainstream America for the first time in my life. And I remember thinking that depending on, how things go, depending on how my life goes from that point, I may, happen to find someone who is, a Christian, say a Christian, and even thinking that it would be easy enough for me to convert to another religion if circumstances dictated.
Okay.
And so I went into college with the intent of just leaving behind my background, and I started out in political science actually, thinking that maybe I could become a lawyer or something.
And was that back in the 60s when you were in college?
Yeah, I started in '67.
Okay, so political science was a popular subject.
Right,
Yeah.
And I spent a year in political science, but it was, you're taking basically core courses anyway. But as I started to think about it, I said, I just don't think that that's the direction I want to go in. So I was thinking, well, what did I do well in high school? And said, well, I think a lot of Asian kids, we did well in math. So I actually switched over to math, and then took my first course and first college course in math, and realized that mathematics on a college level is a completely different animal from high school. And within one semester, I was thinking, I just don't have the smarts to succeed in this field. So I thought, well, what takes like similar principles, but maybe a little bit easier for me to succeed in? And I actually changed over to economics, and I was in econ for a year. But it just happened. Maybe I think we had a term system, back in those days, so 3 terms, during one academic year. And I think it was the second term that I had a free, class. So I thought, well, just try, just to see what it's like. I enrolled in a class on comparative religions, East and West, taught by this professor by the name of Franklin Jocelyn. He was the head of the religious studies department at the time. And I took the class without any expectations. But, he starts out in Hinduism, starts in Asia, and then gets into Buddhism. And as he's talking about Buddhism and teaching us about the Dharma, I realized, very quickly, that I can't be anything but Buddhist. Up until that time, I was thinking I could be anything. I didn't really identify myself as a Buddhist because during my upbringing, even though I was, we actually lived in the temple for a number of years, and I went to services every Sunday, and participated in youth programs, and so forth, but really didn't have much interest, didn't really understand, other than the real simple Eightfold Path, 6 Paramitas type of Buddhism. And so listening to him, it was, as if I was receiving the Dharma for the first time in my life. And it is ironic that he was a former Presbyterian minister, but who did live in Japan and who studied at Waseda University in Tokyo for a number of years, had a very keen understanding and appreciation of Buddhism. And so that it was kind of like my conversion, although I was already a Buddhist, it was like converting to Buddhism for the first time in my life.
Wow.
And so I went to him after that course was completed, and I said, Dr. Jocelyn, I'd like to consider switching over to religious studies. And he asked me, what I'd done, what courses I'd taken. He says, well, if you focus on religion, your last year, then I think you can graduate. So he took me on as his student and finished out, Occidental as a religious studies major. And then the other thing, and this was like from 67 through to 71, and so it was during the height of Vietnam, and all of us, the male students were, the whole campus, except for maybe the ROTC students, were anti-Vietnam War. And we're all thinking of ways that we can, continue to avoid the draft after we graduate.
Yeah.
And I had friends who, ran away to Canada. I had a Japanese American friend who, on the day of his physical, in the morning, he drank a quart of shoyu, or soy sauce, to raise his, blood pressure up.
Yeah.
He was given a deferment, but we were all thinking of different ways of trying to get out of the draft, and the easiest was to continue with your education. And so I thought, well, maybe the safest thing for me is to try to get out of the country and to maybe enter a graduate school where I could, continue my studies, avoid the draft, and, live outside of the United States. And I had a friend who he was not at Occidental, but we were friends from high school, and he was kind of pursuing a similar course. And so we talked about it one day. He said, well, why don't we just go to Japan and see what happens? So we wrote a letter to the College of our denomination, Otani University in Kyoto, and they accepted us provisionally. They said, just come over, and then you could take the entrance exams, and we're pretty sure you can make it. So we just bought a ticket, sent a copy of our ticket to the draft board, and just left and just went to Japan. But at the time, I still wasn't thinking in terms of becoming a priest. I was thinking more in terms of just continuing with my Buddhist studies, and maybe going into teaching or something like that. And then another interesting thing that happened while I was under the guidance of Dr. Jocelyn is that he found out, through our conversations, that I was from a Jodo Shinshu, or Pure Land background. And so he encouraged me to do some of my independent studies on Pure Land. And this is like, in the late 60s, and very few books on Pure Land Buddhism. There are already quite a few, D.T. Suzuki, Yamamatsu, and so forth on Zen, and on, early Buddhism.
Early Buddhism, the Vipassana or Theravada. But the Pure Land is oftentimes overlooked, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. And so he encouraged me to do this, and so I went to the library, found some, translations, sacred books of the East, translations by Max Mueller and others. And I read the three Pure Land Sutras, and but what was really disturbing was kind of like the preface to the translation, in which I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was Max Mueller who says, I've done the translations of the three Pure Land Sutras, but I'm disappointed with them. Something to that.
With his translation?
No, I'm disappointed with the content of the sutras. That I don't feel that they are in line with the teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. But I am doing this because I have so many friends in Japan who are Pure Land Buddhists, and I know them to be very fine people, and so I'm publishing these translations. Well, that's a kind of a, it's certainly not a glowing, recommendation or anything. No. And then I read them, and I'm having trouble trying to understand and, verify that these are Buddhist texts. Yeah. Because my interest was Zen, my interest was, in early Buddhism, in Shakyamuni Buddhism. And so then it was Dr. Jocelyn who kind of helps me out, bails me out. Okay. And it's because he was a student of the New Theism movement. A student of Paul Tillich. Oh yes. And so he, his interpretation or his understanding of God is different from the traditional view. I see. They use terms, as you probably know, like ground of our being or ultimate reality. Yes. In describing or not describing, but referring to God, Godhead, Godheit. And he says maybe you're having trouble understanding Amida or Amitabha. Maybe you can understand it in these terms. Yeah. And that helps me tremendously. And so with a kind of a renewed enthusiasm, I go to Japan, enter into a master's program, and find good teachers who are able to interpret the teachings and who didn't apologize for the teachings. Right. Yeah. Right. Another interesting thing that happened though was so my friend and I, were in this college, graduate level. We're going through our studies, and we have some contact with the Mother Temple because my father, has let them know that we're there. So then they just kind of assume that, well, Reverend Ito's son is here studying. He must be here studying to become a priest. So then they just kind of, just arbitrarily set up, kind of a schedule for us. And they say, we arrived in September, and they say, in November, we're going to have you go through the ceremony. And my Japanese was really bad. Is that the ordination ceremony that you're talking about? It turned out to be the ordination ceremony, but my Japanese was so bad that I really wasn't understanding what they're saying. Yeah. Next thing we know, we're led into, we're at the Mother Temple, and they actually had this little barber shop right there. And I was kind of, not a out-and-out hippie, but, I certainly had long hair. A child of the 60s, you had longer hair, I guess. Yeah. I mean, during college, I had hair down halfway down my back. Okay. And my hair was, kind of like what defined me. Yeah. And so they take me to the barber shop, and they say, okay, we're going to shave your head. And that was a shock. And you weren't expecting that at all? I wasn't really, they said some, I did understand that it was some kind of ceremony, but I really didn't know. Yeah. So we're ordained, and it was my friend who was a Japanese American, third generation like me, and then a Caucasian from Chicago who was studying at the same university. Okay. So the three of us went through ordination together. And the good thing was it was in the cold of winter. It was like the end of November that we went through the ceremony. Okay. So it's so cold that we're wearing ski caps, and so we could walk around town with our ski caps. And then right after we had the ceremony, we'd go have lunch together. And two of us looked Japanese, one looked was a foreigner. Yeah. And we'd walk into a restaurant, and then we'd be speaking English. And then we take our ski caps off, and all three of us are bald, and they don't know what to make of us. But anyways, those are some of the. Well, it's interesting because you sort of got ordained by mistake. Almost, yeah. Even though your whole family, generation after generation, had been priests. Right. Mm-hmm. So now here you are with your ordination. And did you decide to keep it then? Did it make sense to you at that point? Well, they explained it. Our tradition. The initial ordination is probably the simplest ceremony of all the Buddhist, traditions.
Okay.
Because our founder, he happened to be ordained. He took initial ordination at the age of 9.
And who was
Shinran Shonin.
And he was alive when?
He was from 1173 to 1262.
Okay.
So basically 12th century.
And he just for people who have never heard of this kind of Buddhism before, he was the founder of your school of Buddhism.
Although he certainly didn't see himself as a founder,
right?
In the same way that Shakyamuni didn't see himself as the founder of a religion,
exactly,
or denomination or anything, but a denomination formed or was established after his death. He was actually a student of Honen Shonin, who was the founder of the Jodo, or the Pureland school of Buddhism.
Okay, and this is a different sect of Pure Land then?
Right. It's the more traditional.
He started?
Yeah.
It's more traditional.
Yeah, and then
it's called the Shingon?
It's called Jodo Shinshu.
Jodo Shinshu.
In the United States, I think the most accepted term is Shin Buddhism.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so he was 1100?
Yes,
okay.
1173, 1262,
okay.
so 12th, 13th century.
And there had already been a Pure Land sect established in Japan?
Yes, it was,
With Honen?
Yes, Honen. Honen was actually his direct teacher. So the school hadn't been there for long.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was all coming out of the Tendai or the Tiantai tradition.
Yes.
The Tiantai or Tendai in Japanese was one of the two major schools after the Nara period, which is the initial period of Buddhism. And so Shingon is the esoteric, school.
Mm-hmm.
Tendai,
like a tantric kind of school?
Yes.
Okay.
And then Tendai had some of that esoteric, aspect to it. But it was a very kind of comprehensive. I mean, I think it's probably the closest to the kind of Buddhism that you would find in China.
I see.
Which would include like Lotus Sutra, Zen meditation, and Pure Land.
Okay.
So it included all of that.
Okay.
And what happened in Japan is that Tendai was this, comprehensive form of Buddhism, but Dogen was a student at the Tendai monastery, took Zen out.
Yes.
And then Nichiren was a student of Tendai and took the Lotus Sutra, out. And then Honen and Shinran were also students at the Tendai monastery. They took the Pure Land.
Oh, I see.
And so, whereas in China it was never divided into different denominations. Mm-hmm. It was kind of, kept under one umbrella. Mm-hmm. In Japan, it, developed into separate schools.
Separate schools.
Yes.
Okay.
Separate teachings.
Separate teachings. Okay. Wow. Thank you for that, because it's for me it's confusing.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me, after having read the little bit that I've read, that was a very important time in Japanese Buddhism.
Yes.
There was a lot of upheaval and transition going on.
Yes, that's right.
And some really remarkable people came out of that.
Yes. I think, many of the great, Buddhists came out of that Kamakura period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So now you're in Japan, and you've gone through this sort of simple ceremony, one of the most simple, you said, and are you thinking about now going back to the States, or do you have more studies to do in Japan?
That was like within 6 months of our arrival in Japan.
Within 6 months, you've become ordained.
But it's like initial ordination.
First ordination.
And
okay.
I was going to say that Shinran, because there's no definitive reason why he was ordained at such a young age.
Okay.
But one thing was that he was orphaned at an early age, and that was one of the contributing factors.
Okay.
But at age 9, he is ordained and he enters a monastery.
Yeah.
And so we have a tradition in our denomination of ordaining the first sons at the age of 9.
Okay.
And so you don't have to studied much. You don't have to have done much. It's really the first step. It's the first commitment that you make
Yeah.
towards becoming a student of the Buddha.
Okay.
So that's the way they explained it to me. They said it's there's no responsibilities attached to.
So you didn't have to run a temple
Right,
or
anything
any
like
of
that.
lead
Right.
services or anything.
Yeah, you can wear the simple robes, but you couldn't teach. You couldn't do anything. It's just the first step.
The first step.
Yeah.
Okay.
It took me another 3 years
Uh-huh.
to go to the next step.
Okay.
Well, actually, to decide to go to the next step, and then to actually do the full ordination.
Okay, so during those 3 years, you were still deciding if it felt right,
That's
if it was the path you wanted to take.
Yes.
Okay. And was there a point where you said, yeah, this is it, and I'm
Well, I
going to go?
think part of it was I was in a master's program, and I thought that in order for me to go on and teach in academia, that I would I would have to get my doctorate.
Okay.
But I was struggling so much with just the master's that I thought, it's probably overstretching to think that I could become, a teacher on say, the college level, and that maybe being a priest would be the alternative. And the other thing is, I don't know if you felt it, yourself, but in the United States we have we kind of there's a kind of a, I guess, what I'm trying to say is that clergy of any kind are looked at with higher standards.
Yes.
And so, you're kind of,
Forced into being more disciplined in
Right.
the way you live your life.
yes.
Because
exactly.
you're a clergy.
Right.
You don't have as many options.
Right. And, I was pretty wild growing up in high school and college. And I would, kind of watch my father and see how he lived.
Yeah.
And one of the things was, when we were young, he would often take us on a vacation to Reno. I mean, I'm sorry, not Reno, Lake Tahoe.
Lake Tahoe, okay.
And, and so very nice place to go,
Sure.
and daytime we could enjoy, hiking and, things like that. But I realized that at night he goes elsewhere. He goes to the casinos. Right. And that's kind of one of the reasons why he liked Lake Tahoe as a kind of a family vacation site.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't so much that he was really into gambling, but he liked to drink and just kind of maybe just to get away from the pressures of being at the temple.
Sure, sure.
And so on one occasion, maybe the third time we were there or something, he's in the casino and he happens to meet a person from Los Angeles, not a member of the temple, but someone that he knows, in the community. The man comes up to him and says, "Oh, Ito Sensei, Reverend Ito, gee, I never thought I would see you here. I didn't think that you people enjoyed this kind of thing." And that was a really embarrassing experience for my father.
It was.
And he never went back. The only time he would say go to Las Vegas or something is if he had a visitor from Japan that he would take. But I watched that and I saw the kind of the struggle the inner struggle that he was having.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, I don't think I can do that, and I don't think that I want to have to live according to these stringent rules. And so that was one of the reasons why it was I never thought of the priesthood as a career.
And what age were you at this point? Do you remember when you were in your master's program?
It was probably about 22, 23.
Oh, yeah. That's so young to think about living a straight and narrow life.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so, but then, what happens is in Japan, like here in the United States, all the priests are called sensei. So Ito Sensei, Kusawa Sensei. And so that whether you're in the temple or whether you're out, walking the streets, you're always Ito Sensei.
Always sensei.
So it's always kind of like you're just, you're, this, what do you call it? I mean, you're not just a regular person.
That's right. That's right.
Whereas in Japan, they don't use the term sensei for priests. for some reason, So the, sensei is a title that's used for doctors and for teachers primarily, and maybe like politicians, upper echelon politicians, but not for priests. And so you could be walking down the street and you're just Ito-san, Mr. Ito, unless you're performing, a ritual, a service or something. Then, of course, they would use an appropriate title. And I met these wonderful, people, both teachers at the college as well as priests at the Mother Temple, who kind of took me under their wings and taught me the chanting and all of these things. And we'd go out, and they were able to separate, their professional life from their personal life, to be, and in our tradition, our Jodo Shinshu tradition allows us to do that, to get married and have family and so forth. And so I thought, well, if they could do it, then maybe I could do it also.
Okay.
And so it was meeting these people, these great teachers in Japan, that gave me the kind of the confidence.
And they allowed you to see how to do it.
Right.
You couldn't figure quite out how to live both kinds of lives at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even really like a conscious, effort to separate between your career or your profession as a priest and your everyday life.
Yeah.
But that they just really were able to be themselves.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, if I was, I came to Buddhism late in life. I was 30, 28, 30 when I found out about Buddhism, and I was in my 40s when I got ordained. So if I had been in my early 20s, I don't think I would have even thought of it as an option, because in my 20s I was sort of wild and having a good time. And then as I got older, I saw that it was pretty empty stuff and didn't really matter that much. So now you have your first ordination and you've got your master's degree. You're not quite sure whether you want to go to PhD. You decided, well, maybe I'll be a priest. And you figured out how to live in the world and live at the temple at the same time, because these people took you under the wing. Right. So at that point, did you come back to America, or did you did? Okay.
I finished my master's. I finished the training for the priesthood, and got my full ordination.
Okay.
And then I guess I communicated with the temple and said I would consider accepting a position as a priest at the temple.
Yeah.
And I think I was probably the first priest at any of our temples who was a native English speaker.
Okay.
And so just that alone was enough, to
make you a good candidate.
Right.
You had a skill that was necessary or useful.
Yeah. Although I wasn't anywhere near ready.
Yeah. Well, now this is an interesting point too, because a lot of people think, well, once you become ordained, it's all done. But generally speaking, in my own case and the other people I've talked to, it's not all done. It's just the beginning.
Right.
And so now you needed to learn the workings of the temple.
Right.
So when you were hired as the priest of the temple, did you start off at the bottom and then you had to sort of work your way up?
Yeah. At the time, we had already 3 priests, including my father.
Okay.
So I had 2 older, what we call senpai, mentors.
Okay, so they had seniority.
Right. And so I was at the bottom of the totem pole.
Okay.
And, it took me maybe a good 5 years to get comfortable.
Okay.
To feel as though I was contributing.
Yeah. Well, and hopefully people listening to this will see that if they've read a book on Buddhism and have decided that they want to be a Buddhist clergy, it surely doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
There's the education part, there's the practice part, and then there's the training part that goes on forever.
Right. That's right.
So as you were the priest at the temple, then did you marry your wife from the temple? Did you meet her here?
Well, actually, she was a member of another temple.
Another temple, okay.
Yeah, but we had an active youth program, high school, basically high school kids. And the temples in Southern California, they would, they had this. We still have a league association. And so we'd have all these activities, seminars and sometimes social activities, retreats, conferences, things like that. And my wife happened to be the advisor of the youth group at the West LA Temple, near UCLA.
Okay.
Because she actually grew up in Gilroy, California, which is near San Jose.
Yep, I know right where that is.
The garlic capital.
The garlic capital,
yes.
That's right.
Right, so she grew up there, but she went to UCLA,
okay.
And after she graduated, she decided to stay, found a job, and found the temple and started, becoming active, and eventually became the advisor. And a friend, a priest at the Honganji temple, we were in Japan together, got to be friends, and so we were like the respective advisors for our respective chapters. And we would go to these events together. And he knew Janet from, because he was from San Francisco, and so, the districts were closer. So he knew Janet, even though she was a lot younger. So he introduced me to her. And, it was an interesting thing. It was like, we all wear like name tags.
Yes.
And so they misspelled her last name. And her last name was Sakai, S-A-K-A-I, but they spelled it S-E-K-A-I. And I've never seen a last name, that's written S-E-K-A-I, because S-E-K-A-I in Japanese means world, or like Mother Earth, And so I looked at the name tag and I said, gee, that's I've never seen that name before. And it just kind of stuck in my mind. I don't know, maybe her other features stuck in my mind as well, but the name certainly did.
Sure.
Then I found out, after I saw her the next time, that it was a misspelling, and she had a more ordinary last name. But that's how we met.
And is in the culture is marrying a priest a good thing to do? So you look at that as, sometimes people say marrying politicians is good, or marrying lawyers and doctors is good. Is marrying a priest considered to be a good
I think that
marriage move?
Yeah, for the regular member, who's not like involved, in maintaining the temple, like on the board of directors or something, who doesn't know all the ins and outs, would consider it to be a good thing.
Okay.
But those who are like close and who know of the struggles,
how much work it is,
and how much sacrifice the ministers make and so forth,
sure.
probably steer their children away. But one of the things, I guess, as far as her parents were concerned, is and you see this in your communities too, but a lot of marrying out of your ethnic community.
Yeah.
And so my wife was the third child of four, and her older brother and her older sister had already married outside, outside of the community, and her younger brother was getting set to marry, a Caucasian also. And so when Janet went to her parents and said, "I'm thinking of marrying, Nori Ito," they were, basically overjoyed because I was Japanese American.
Sure.
The interesting thing, though, was her grandmother on her father's side, her both grandparents were devout Seventh-day Adventists.
Wow.
And they were Seventh-day Adventists from Japan, in Japan. They came over, and continued, in their faith. And so Janet takes me to meet her grandmother, and she sees me and says, "Oh," and she's so happy. And says, "Oh, you're marrying, someone from our community," very overjoyed. But so then we have the wedding, and of course her grandmother's there, and she sees me coming out in my Buddhist robe because I was already a priest. And that was a big shock to her.
Was there a little bit of tension there?
A little bit, but then what happened was she accepted our marriage very graciously.
Oh, wonderful.
And then every time that we went to see her, the other thing that she enjoyed was the fact that I could speak Japanese, because none of her grandchildren could speak Japanese, and none of their spouses could speak Japanese. So here, I come along and I could speak to her in Japanese. So she liked that about me. she wasn't real happy about the Buddhist part. And so every time we'd meet and have some time for conversation, she would bring out her books and her pamphlets.
For religion?
Yeah, and she would try to, make me see, the value of her tradition.
Yeah.
And so actually, in a sense, it was my first interreligious dialogue.
Okay. Yes. Well, now to jump ahead a little bit, you are the director of the Buddhist Club at Occidental.
Yes.
And so when you went there, they didn't have one. Has there been one there for a while?
Yes. Well, I came along and started the first group.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and so this was back in 1987 or so. So it's
was
almost
there any
been 20
resistance from the university?
No, not at all.
Not at all. Okay.
There was a man by the name of Doug Gray who was a Congregationalist Christian, who was the head of the department or head of the religious life.
Okay.
And they already had a Newman group, Catholic group, Hillel, Jewish group, maybe 3 Christian groups. They even had Latter-day Saints and Christian Science was already there too. And I happen to have known the person who was the Catholic advisor.
I see.
Through a community. And so she knew that I was an alum, and so she called me up and said, I think we've been looking at our student list, and we see there's an increasing number of Asian students, many of who put Buddhism as their background religion, and so we think that it's time to start a Buddhist group, and so would you be interested? And so I jumped at the opportunity, and so I went and then got the list from them. And it was maybe, 30 or 40 Asian students, some of who were Japanese American, and who I imagine probably went through the Young Buddhist Association, the youth groups at our temples. So I sent notices to all of them and said, we're going to look into starting up a group, and so please come. And I think the first notice I sent out, I only got like 1 or 2 students that came, and there just wasn't much interest.
Yeah.
And but then they supplied me with another list, and it was students who were non-Asian, but who had an interest in Buddhism or in meditation. So I sent out notices to them, and they came. Yeah. And so basically, over like almost 20 years of being the advisor there. I probably had, I can probably count the number of Asians that have been, part of the group.
Okay.
It's primarily been a non-Asian group.
And so it leads me to believe that in the West there's a real strong interest in Buddhism, and meditation, I guess, in particular.
Yeah.
Do you think it's important to have a Buddhist presence on campus?
I definitely think so.
Okay.
And when I first started out in '87, the Buddhist group was the smallest group, of all the faith groups that were on campus, by far.
Yeah.
We only had maybe 5 or 6, and there were weeks when I'd go and nobody would show up. But eventually, as time passed, the group, started to get larger, more active, and students would stay with me the whole 4 years that they were there, and really become totally, truly Buddhist.
Yeah.
Within 2 years.
Wow.
And start living a Buddhist lifestyle that surpassed my own, so-called Buddhist lifestyle in many ways. And about maybe 2 years ago, I looked at the lists of all the faith groups on campus, and the Buddhist group, at least the in numbers, we were like the number 2 group.
Wow.
Next to the Catholic group.
Wow.
And so we've grown from our humble beginnings, and it's amazing. I mean, we'd have maybe like at the start of the year, we'd have like 40 students on the list. On a campus of 1,600 students, so it's had its impact. on Occidental.
Well, and that I can segue into this then, maybe from that too, because I've spoken at your temple a couple times, and I've always enjoyed it. And when I come here, I've noticed that there were a lot of Japanese and a lot of older Japanese, but also younger Americans, Westerners here too, learning about Buddhism. If somebody's listening to this and feels a desire to go to a Buddhist temple, do you think they should be anxious about that when somebody comes here for the first time, say a Westerner comes, and you know they don't know anything about the protocol? Do you make them feel comfortable? Do you give them information? What the schedule is?
We try, we try to the best of our abilities to welcome new people, guests to the temple, and we have a service book, in the pews that explains the service, the format, the symbolism behind, the things that we do, what is incense offering for, and so forth.
Okay.
And so that if they just read a few of those pages, then they would at least know what's going on and why. And
so they wouldn't really even need to ask a whole lot of questions if they just looked at that book.
Right.
They would.
Yes.
Okay.
And then we've been trying to do more kind of like discussion, informal, instead of like, the priest standing up there and, kind of like preaching in quotes, just making it much more interactive and, to maybe, sit in the hondo, in the main sanctuary, and I would talk, but would invite questions or, discussion.
Okay.
Or when we have a smaller group, we would even come in here and just have a discussion.
And just sit around a table and ask questions and things. So it would take a little bit of courage, but once the process started, it would feel familiar pretty quickly. And everybody I've met here has been so courteous and gracious, and I feel like an old friend every time I come to visit. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, it was interesting. About maybe 3 months ago, we had some students from Loyola Marymount.
Oh, yeah.
And, I guess they were writing a report or something, and they came. And so I had a chance to talk with them and, answer some questions after the gathering was over. And they were both raised Catholic. And, they grew up going to church. And they said, that being here, it felt so comfortable. Because it reminded them of their childhood.
Yeah.
I guess the altar kind of looks, it's ornate in the same way that a Catholic church is.
Sure.
And we have the chanting, or, it's completely different, but anyways, they felt very comfortable here.
Wonderful. And speaking about the Catholics and the Buddhists, now the Los Angeles Buddhist Catholic Dialogue has been going on since 1989, and you've been a member for a while. When did you become interested in the Buddhist Catholic Dialogue?
I think it was through the encouragement of two people.
Okay.
One was Michael Kersey.
Oh, yes.
Who was the director at Occidental College of Religious Life for a number of years.
Okay.
And who I, learned so much from. And then the other was Reverend Mas Kodani, who was my, mentor at Senshin.
Yes.
And the two of them were active. And
okay.
So, yeah. But I have to admit that I haven't been a very good member over the last few years. But I have the next meeting on my calendar.
Well, it's hard to go to every meeting, that's for sure, because they actually happen every month. And I know my schedule, and I'm sure your schedule sometimes doesn't permit you to attend. But for somebody listening to this who's never thought about Catholics and Buddhists coming together, do you, after being a part of it, do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it helps to understand the other?
I think it's a wonderful thing.
Okay.
I've learned so much from the experience myself. And I think that because it's a group that has been in existence for a long time, people can be quite frank with each other.
Yeah.
And so it's, like I'm involved in a number of other circles where when you don't know each other well enough, you tend to be too cautious.
Yes.
And so you don't ask the penetrating questions, or so that it's just kind of superficial. It's just people coming together, saying good things about each other and saying goodbye. Whereas the Buddhist Catholic dialogue, I think it has a lot more substance, and it really is a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned from you at one of the Buddhist Catholic dialogues we attended was the fact that every year you take students to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When I look at the news today and read the newspapers and go online, I see everybody wants nuclear weapons. And we're both from the 60s.
Yes.
And there was a whole different understanding about nuclear weapons in the 60s. And that seems to have changed for some reason. Could you just talk a little bit about why you decided to do that? What was your inspiration to take students to Japan and see those two places? And then what is their reaction? What do you see and what is their reaction?
Yeah, I've been leading the youth group to Japan for about 10 years now, over 10 years, I think. In the first few years, it wasn't that we avoided those places, but we just went to other historical areas, more that have significance to our teaching or to our history.
Like ancient Buddhist temples?
Yes.
Okay.
Areas where the founder lived and where temples were established and so forth.
Okay.
But one year I thought that it would be a great experience to take the kids to Hiroshima.
And had you been there before?
I had been there. I was there as a student.
Okay.
So it had been many, many years, since I had the chance to revisit.
Okay.
And one of the interesting things about what happened in my life with regard to Hiroshima was when I decided to go to Japan to study back in '71. I had the chance to stop. Back in those days, they had flights that stopped in Hawaii and then went to Japan. So I stopped in Hawaii and stayed there for a few days, and I went to the Pearl Harbor Memorial for the first time in my life. And I was there and paying my respects. And although I totally identified myself as an American, I also acknowledged the fact that I was born in Japan. That my long-term history was Japan, so that I had to identify myself at least to a small part as a Japanese. And being at Pearl Harbor and thinking to myself, how could the people of Japan, my country, have done this to Americans or to people? Yeah. Feeling this tremendous guilt, at the same time. Sadness.
It must have been a really interesting dichotomy for you, to American Japanese, Japanese coming over attacking America, and your allegiance lies in both places.
Right. I mean, and I'm sure that that's exactly what happened with the Japanese that were living in Hawaii and on the West Coast. And maybe to a certain extent, that's what kind of like enabled them to go quietly into the camps.
I see.
Because there was this kind of underlying guilt, of being Japanese, and how could our people have done something like that?
Just to, and this is a digression, so people listening, excuse me for digressing, but did Buddhism go to the camps? Did they have Buddhist service in the camps?
Not at first.
Not at first.
In fact, what happened was when the FBI started rounding up all of the Japanese, the first people that they arrested and took away were the leaders of the Japanese American communities.
And that included clergy?
It included Buddhist priests, and included like Japanese language teachers, the heads of the different organizations and so forth. But the Buddhist priests were among the first locked up and taken away. And they were taken away to these camps that people don't really talk about because they're so small. But they were like the most dangerous, considered to be the most dangerous people from American government point of view. And they weren't released into the regular camps for maybe over a year. So although there are many Buddhists who were relocated to Manzanar and to Jerome and to the big camps, the clergy weren't available because they were all locked up somewhere in almost like maybe not maximum security, but almost like in prison-like conditions.
Wow.
Until the threat was over. I mean, almost kind of like Guantanamo in a sense. Yeah,
that's what it sounds like.
Think about, but so that the Christian clergy were there in the camps, and they were holding services, but the Buddhists, there were very few Buddhist priests who were available in any of the camps. And finally, they were released, and they were given the permission to hold services and so forth, so that religious services according to Buddhist tradition were maybe in the from the second year on allowed in the camps.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. That's interesting.
We just did. We have a group called the Nikkei Interfaith Fellowship.
Okay.
And we just put together a book. In fact, I'll give you a copy.
Oh, thank you.
But well, it's more like a pamphlet.
Okay.
But stories of internment, stories of Buddhists and Christians working together, and so forth.
And where we're sitting right now, your temple's on 3rd Street,
yes,
which is, I guess, in Little Tokyo or pretty close. And isn't there a new museum that just opened up relatively recently?
Yes.
That documents the plight of the people who were incarcerated?
Yeah. The Japanese American National Museum.
Okay.
They call it JANM.
Okay.
And they're right on the corner of 1st and Central. And their first exhibit space was actually the old Nishi Honganji temple, which the city originally condemned, but I guess they were able to retrofit it so that it's usable now.
Oh, good, good.
But they also built a bigger second wing.
I see.
And have both permanent as well as, permanent exhibits as well as traveling exhibits.
Traveling exhibits, okay. Well, now let's go back to Hawaii, and you're faced with this sort of dilemma.
Right.
You have allegiance to America, you have allegiance to Japan, and you're looking at the memorial, and you must have, twisted or pulled on your heart in a very interesting way.
And then I go to Japan, and student there, living there, and a couple of years later I have a chance to visit Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And it was almost like the same experience, but it was the opposite. Yeah. And so I'm going through the memorial and the museum where they have all the artifacts and the photos, the terrible photos and so forth, and feeling this tremendous guilt because now I'm identifying myself as an American. And it's kind of like, and it's kind of like the karma of the Japanese American.
Yeah.
That's what we have to live with.
Yeah.
But it's such a moving experience that you go through it, and you just can't help but have this. Have a commitment to do something. I know that I can't change the world, but in my small way, to do something, at least to tell the stories.
Yeah.
To make people understand how terrible nuclear arms are.
So you had started taking the students over to Japan, and the second or third year you decided, well, let's go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and introduce the students to this history, this part of history.
Right.
And what was their take on that? Because if they were young, they probably even like Chernobyl wasn't in the reality. Because I think that's the 70s or 80s. So what was their impression when they saw the devastation and the absurdity of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think that of course all of the kids have learned history, and so they knew that World War II happened and that the atomic bombs were dropped and so forth. They knew that intellectually. Yeah. But to go through and to actually see the suffering, the photographs and these artifacts that were found, that twisted pieces of metal, that you just unimaginable, the heat that must have been generated to or these iron doors that were just blasted off. And then also I think one of the most moving things is seeing the videos of survivors who talked, in their own, using their own words of the horrific conditions that they had to endure. And they also have these drawings. I guess it was a therapeutic, to get these survivors to draw what they remember. And just, it depicts horrors that are just unimaginable.
Yeah. And is there a room with bones or something, some kind of?
Yes. Well, that was in Nagasaki.
That was in Nagasaki.
Yeah. I took a group of students to Nagasaki, and we didn't have a place to stay, and we're on a limited budget, and so we got permission to stay at our temple in Nagasaki, only maybe a mile away from the station. And it's a small temple, but they have a courtyard in front, kind of a garden, and they have this big monument. It's about a 10-foot monument, and inscribed are 4 Chinese characters: Hisen, Hikaku Hisen, and translated, into English, it would mean no nukes, no war. Hisen, Hikaku Hisen, yeah. So no nukes, no war. And the priest came out and explained the monument to us. And what he wanted to emphasize is it doesn't say Hansen. The word for like anti-war, like anti-war movements and so forth, is Hansen. But it doesn't say Hansen. It says Hisen, no war, not anti-war. And the reason why is because when you say anti, then you're on one side and you're protesting against other people, people who disagree with you. So in this case, those who favor nuclear arms or who advocate for war, you're just putting yourself, on the other side and just kind of criticizing, from a kind of a lofty position. But he says when you say no nukes, no war, you're telling yourself. It's not addressed to others; it's addressed to yourself.
That's fascinating.
And then there's this little pathway that leads down from the courtyard, goes down into kind of an alley area, and there, right underneath this 10-foot monument, is a vault, and it's got like metal doors. And so after he explained the monument to us, he took us down, opened the vault, and I guess he had already prepared for our visit, and so he had inside there's about maybe 10 iron it's like foot lockers. Okay. With doors that open up like this, and so he had one open already, and he said in this vault contains the cremains of some 10 to 20,000 people
who died because of the bomb.
Yes, at Nagasaki. And so he had one of them open, and and there was a skull sitting there, and some other bones. Most of it's ash, but some bones sitting there. And he tells our kids, he says, "Well, I'm sure that you've seen bones, human bones before, but you can tell, by looking, you see that the color is different. It's a lot darker."
That's because of the radiation.
Yes. Right. Wow. And and it was interesting because we spent 3 days in Kyoto going through a retreat, and then we visited one other place before going to Nagasaki. And every time that we would enter a temple or sit for a service, I would have to remind the kids to put their hands together in gassho. And and so they'd just be sitting there and say, "Okay, everyone gassho," and then they'd all do it. Well, when we went to that vault, and he opened the doors for us, all of the kids just, naturally and automatically put their hands together and bowed.
Paying respect.
Yeah.
Wow.
And my son happened to be on that particular tour. And right after that, we went to the museum. We went through, the exhibits there. And that evening, we were having dinner, and my son says to me, today was a life-changing day for me. And I couldn't, I had absolutely no appetite. Even now, I basically have lost my appetite, and I just can't help, but think about what happened, 55 years ago. And another thing was we were going through the museum, and I guess the priest, when he was explaining the monument, he said, we didn't put this up to criticize the United States or to say who was right or wrong. This is just to say that this is an example of the cruelty that human beings can inflict upon each other.
Yeah.
And it's not to choose sides or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we go to the museum, and we're going through the exhibits, and one of the older kids, he was a college student already, comes up to me and he says, Sensei, why is it wrong for us to hate the Americans who did this? Because he was just filled with hate, even though he's an American himself.
Yeah.
I mean, he was filled with hate for those who made those decisions.
Sure.
But I told him, I said, well, it's not, it really is an example of, how cruel we can be to each other. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that, therefore these people are right. And the Japanese, whether it's Hiroshima or Nagasaki, they're very careful. They'll point out all of the facts. One of the things that I really appreciate is how they point out how many nuclear arms, like say the United States has. They have this one that's really, it's like this, it's a video that they show. And they'll say the first one was built here, and then the second one here. And then Russia came along, and then France came along, and so they point out all of the nuclear weapons that have been built that still exist, and how dangerous that is.
Yeah.
But we just really don't think about it unless it's pointed out to us like that.
Now we have Pakistan and India.
Yeah.
And Iran seems to want to have one. I don't know if that's the truth or not, but everybody seems to want one, and I think we've forgotten what they're used for,
right?
And what happens when we do use them. And as far as I can tell, when it comes to war, there aren't any winners. Everybody's a loser.
Yeah, that's why I really wish that the leaders of all of the countries, President Bush, first of all, but all of them could go maybe together, and go through both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and see, just experience for themselves, the stories that are continuing to be told.
And like you said a few minutes ago, you said, well, there's not much I can do myself. I'm just one person, but like the inscription on the monument says, no war. So what we can do, I suppose, is tell ourselves,
that's right.
No war.
That's right.
And no nukes. Yeah, I guess that's a good place to start. Wow. Well, I want to thank you very much for this interview, because it's special to me that you were able to take time out of your busy schedule and sit down with me and talk. And I'm sure people listening are going to be taken by what you had to say and how you said it. And hopefully, if anybody's interested in learning more about Buddhism, they'll feel less anxious about that now and realize that Buddhist temples are places where everybody comes. Everybody, I guess, seems to, I want to say this correctly, Buddhists seem to be everywhere. That there's no stereotype of what a Buddhist is. And Buddhist temples are open to everybody who's interested in Buddhism.
That's right.
And do you have a website?
Yes.
And could you give us the address of your website?
It's www.hhbt-la.org. And the HHBT stands for Higashi Honganji Buddhist Temple, and LA is Los Angeles.
And if they go to the website, will they be able to find the schedule of the temple here?
Yes.
And the events that are occurring?
Yes.
And would you feel comfortable in saying, come on by if they so desire?
With no reservation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, thank you again. And,
thank you.
I hope our paths cross soon so we can have another discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Well, that's it. That was my interview with Reverend Nori Ito, a Buddhist priest at a Pureland Temple in downtown Los Angeles. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you found it useful. If you'd like more information on his temple, please visit their website, www.hhbt-la. That's Harold, Boy Tom, la.org. If you'd like more information on me, please visit my website, kusala.info, kusala.info. If you'd like to listen to some of the past podcasts and see a couple videos I have posted on the internet, please visit my webpage, dharmatalks.info. That's dharmatalks.info. And if you'd like to email me, my email address is kusala@urbandharma.org. Well, until the next time, until the next podcast, be happy, be peaceful, and most of all, be free from suffering.